entitled Living Hope from the book of 1 Thessalonians. So I'm going to invite you. Why don't we gather and we'll meet in 1 Thessalonians chapter 5. And we're going to kind of start our descent. The captain has now come on and he said, please find your seat, put on your seat, fasten your seatbelts. We've begun our descent into the end of this book. We're there. We are heading towards the end, but the end of the flight, the end of the study does not mean it is less in importance or value. The power of these last few verses are significant for our life, and let me just say they are significant for our living hope. Now, we've looked at this idea of living hope for the last several weeks. We talked about how living hope is tied to gospel leaders, how living hope is connected to good gospel biblical relationships. We talked about how living hope is connected to your pursuit of holiness, or how living hope is connected to eschatology. We spent 3 weeks dealing with that. And today I see very clearly in our text that Paul shifts his attention to somewhat of a new topic in verse 12 of chapter 5, and that is to the church. And so we've entitled this sermon from verse 12 through 18, The Church and Hope. And so it's important for us to get what is being said here about the church. And so I want you to find your place in 1 Thessalonians 5. Again, a letter written to this body of believers in the town of Thessalonica. It was the capital city of Macedonia of the Roman Empire, of this Roman province of Macedonia. It was a busy city. It was a bustling city. It was a city that sat on a route that had a lot of visitors come in and out. It was where a freeway, if you will, ran through it. Cracker barrels for Jason's pleasure were planted all over the freeway, if you will, in Thessalonica, so people could get the best southern pies there are, right? And so that's what this city was, and Paul visited this city. People came to Christ, and he, through his personal ministry, began to disciple them, began to tell them about Jesus and their relationship to Christ, and how in the midst of difficult situations and circumstances of life, they could maintain a living hope. That's where we are in 1 Thessalonians 5, verse 12 is where I want you to draw your attention, because now he's giving some incredible instruction regarding how the church operates or works for their hope. Here's what he says. Look at verse 12. We ask you, brothers, we're making a request of you to respect those who labor among you and are over you in the Lord and admonish you, and to esteem them very highly in love because of their work. Be at peace among yourselves. And we urge you, brothers, admonish the idle, encourage the faint-hearted, help the weak, be patient with them all. See that no one repays anyone evil for evil, but always seek to do good to one another and to everyone. Rejoice always. Pray without ceasing. Give thanks in all circumstances, for this is the will of God in Christ Jesus for you. We've often described, when I was working for a period of time here in Arizona at the plant nursery up Ellsworth, that we live in a hostile environment for plants. This is an environment where you have this vision for these beautiful trees and beautiful plants, but it's pretty much like planting some of those plants on Mars. They just don't grow naturally. Now, there are parts of the country where you can spit on the ground and a tree grows and it's green and beautiful, but not here. Here, you have to be very intentional and very careful to create an environment or a soil culture, if you will, that is conducive for the growth and thriving of the plants you want to have, the plants you want to put in here. Like irrigation, for instance. I didn't realize this growing up in a desert out here in the West, but there literally are towns in America who don't put irrigation in and water their grass. Can you believe that? Like some of you are like, yeah, where have you been? I know, that's what I went to Virginia for the first time to visit my wife's family, and I saw all this green grass, and I was like, what time does your water come on? And she's like, water? What are you talking about? Like, it just rains here, and there's humidity, and out here, that's not the reality, is it? You don't water your grass for one day, it turns back into desert, and snakes start crawling out of the ground. It is a hostile environment, and it takes intentionality and some proactivity to make sure that the soil and the ground is healthy, because growing plants requires a healthy environment for them to thrive in. Now, let me say it this way and make that a spiritual illustration or example. and help you understand that your living hope that you live with and live with for your life here on earth, it also requires a healthy environment to be plugged into. And that is, I believe, what Paul is describing for us in 1 Thessalonians 5:12. It takes intentionality and proactivity to make sure that where your living hope is living is a healthy environment. And that brings us to the big idea of the passage. Simple, great truth that we're going to try to pull everything back to this morning. And it's simply this: living hope thrives in a healthy local church. Now listen, if Paul's intent is to encourage the hope of the Thessalonians and to encourage their walk for Jesus in the midst of a difficult situation, then what he's doing here in verse 12 through 18 is he's helping them see how a healthy church environment actually influences and helps their hope thrive. Like an intentional approach to soil helps a plant grow, an intentional approach to church life helps hope thrive. In fact, jot down in your notes Hebrews chapter 10, verse 24 and 25. In Hebrews chapter 10, the writer of Hebrews tells us to consider one another, how to stir up one another to love and good works. And he says we do that by not neglecting to meet together as the habit of some, but encouraging one another all the more as you see the day drawing near. Now, the day is a reference to the day of the Lord, the end times, eschatology. And he's saying that as the day is approaching, as the potential for hope to be robbed, as the potential for wickedness to start winning, you need to get connected more to a healthy body of believers that helps you by stirring you up to love and good works. And you say, well, how often? I don't know that the Bible tells us how often, but I do know that in Hebrews chapter 10, verse 25, he says more. So more. So should you come tonight? Well, yeah, because coming tonight's more than just coming this morning. So I think Hebrews 10:25 would be lived out by you coming, right? You get my logic? Is that inappropriate? No? More. That's the idea. A healthy local church actually encourages us and stirs us up unto love and good works, which is the manifestation of a people living with hope in the midst of the last days. And so living hope thrives in a healthy local church. So the question that we're going to try to answer this morning, and that you should already be asking, is, well, then what makes a local church healthy? Now, this is a huge topic. Volumes and volumes of books have been written. Entire ministries are entitled for ways and methods for you to have a healthy church. Now, I think that Paul doesn't necessarily give us an exhaustive list of everything that it takes to make a healthy church, but he does give us three, what I would say are the main titles or the main headings for categories that really are applied in every aspect of our church life that produces a healthy church for the purpose of a thriving, living hope. So, from the instruction on this, verse 12 through 18, we're going to see how there are three marks of a healthy church, especially applied and played out in three different relationships within the church. Okay? There's three relationships that help us and instruct us on the three marks of a healthy local church. So here's what I want us to do. I'm gonna pause for a second before we get into this, and I just want you to say, I want this. Like, I want this. I want this church to be a healthy. This is my church. This is my family. These are my people. And this is what I want. I want my hope to be living and thriving, so I want this church to be healthy. So I'm going to read this and not read this to say, that's right, that person really needed that. But I'm going to read this and study this and say, I want this to impact me and change my life. So if I can be pastoral in this moment, I just want you as a church to own the truths that Paul gives the church in Thessalonica, and let's apply them today, okay? Here they are. Number one, I want to do it this way. Our church is healthy when, number one, you and I value leaders rightly. Now, I know somebody smirked right there. I already know it. I saw Rich Webb smirking. Yeah, self-serving pastor. Look at this guy. It's there. Now, I want you to see, and I want to unpack what this is saying. Verse 12, we ask you, brothers. So we're making a request of you, brothers. The church, we're asking you to respect those who labor among you and are over you in the Lord and admonish you, to esteem them very highly in love because of their work, and be at peace among yourselves. Now, there's a relationship that Paul is giving us here between leaders of the church and the people of the church. And so we're going to see each one of them rolled out for us. So I'm going to pull these out like kind of pieces of clothing out of the suitcase and say, okay, here's what leaders looks like. Here's what it looks like to be a leader in the church. And this is what he's saying leaders are to do. And this is the response to their leadership that the church is to have. So first, let's look at leaders. So in addressing the church's attitude toward their pastor, we get a glimpse of the work that Paul describes. He says something about their labor. He said to respect those who labor among you. Now, this is an interesting word. It speaks of intense toil to the point of utter exhaustion. It literally was used to describe such hard work that you felt like you got beat up. That was the word that he used here. In fact, 1 Timothy chapter 5, verse 17 tells us that these are people who labor in preaching and teaching. He talks about the same word or uses the same word. MacArthur says it this way, that this is not so much the amount of work, but the effort of the work. So in to a certain degree, he's calling on pastors, hey, work hard. And church, when you recognize that your leaders, your elders, your pastors, and the staff that lead the church, that they work hard, there's a proper response to that. But there is this reality of working hard. Now you say, I can't believe that this is true, because at the end of the day, pastor, you really only work one day a week, right? Like from like maybe 9 to 12. And because you're a mobile church, you have to help break down, which I kind of do sometimes. Some of you laugh at that. But there's this labor that only happens one day of the week. And I play golf Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday, Friday, and Saturday. Do a little bit of work Saturday night to get ready for Sunday, and then work from 9 to 11 or 12 on. Listen, the reality is I think you know that's not what happens. And that isn't what happens with me. That isn't what happens with Greg Ross. That isn't what happens with Jason Huff or Josh Tejada or even Max Webb, who serves our students. We work and we labor, and it is a requirement of us to work hard. That's what he says first. Second, he says something about their leadership. Notice what he says. We ask you, brothers, to respect those who labor among you and are over you. Now, this isn't a lordship kind of over you. Literally, the word means to be placed before you. The word had the basic meaning of standing before, and the idea is leadership. It describes one who exercises a position of leadership. The Bible calls the pastor elder the overseer. It has the idea of leading, protecting, and caring for the church that God has entrusted him to care for, lead, and protect. So the oversight that I believe is described and biblically supported is the oversight of preaching the word, guarding the flock from false teaching, guiding the church in the ways of the Lord, helping receive conflicts between members, overseeing church finances, and providing overall direction for the church. This is their leadership, and Paul addresses it to be important. Now listen, lest we forget the reality of what's taking place here, Hebrews 13:17 reminds us that elders watch for the souls of the church as those who will have to give an account. So what he's calling on here, and he's pointing out, is the leadership of the church, not lording over the church, but in the Lord submitting to the lordship. That's our job as the leaders and the pastors and the spiritual lead of the church. And then he says this, I want you to see, he says something about their love when he says in verse 12, that over you in the Lord and admonish you. The word admonish means to continually instruct, warn, or caution. So the job of the pastor, the job of the leader is to labor hard at overseeing the direction, discipleship, and doctrine of the church and admonish the church, and I believe primarily through the preaching and teaching and discipling with the word of God. In fact, that's what Paul told Timothy in 2 Timothy 4, to preach the word, reprove, rebuke, and exhort. You tracking with that? So the command here is clear. There are people among you, he's saying, that are leaders, that God has appointed to be leaders, that God has set up as overseers, and it is their job to work hard, lead well, and love with a warning and admonishing spirit about them. That's the role of leaders in our congregation. And that doesn't just come in the form of elders, pastors. It comes in the form of those who lead through staff and other areas. So Paul is doing some house cleaning, if you will. Paul is structuring the church in a way and helping them see, listen, you got to be careful to observe the leaders among you and how that they are expected to live. And then when they are living out what God has called them to live out, here's your response to them. You ready? This is the church's responsibility to its leaders. First, he says in verse 12, to respect those who labor among you. Now, the word respect is elsewhere translated to know. Know's not a very solid word for us to understand what it means, but it carries with it the idea of recognition. Now, listen, this doesn't mean that recognize them enough so when you see them at Walmart, you can actually go talk to them. That's not what he's saying. He's saying there's more to that. There's this idea of a recognition of the vital function for which the leaders of the church have been gifted to perform. There's a recognition. This Stedman says that to know them means to recognize them, be aware of them, and do not take them for granted. Now, again, you think, well, man, this is lined up perfect, Pastor, and it's in here, but I just want to emphasize the reality that this applies not just to leaders and pastors. I believe that there is a general reality in which the people who lead the church, the Josh Tejada, Jason Huff, Greg Ross, Max Webb, the others who serve, the deacons that serve, there is a real leadership that takes place in this way, and he says to value them appropriately. That's what the word literally means. Then he says to esteem them very highly in love. To esteem them highly in love. The verb translated esteem is to think or to consider. Very highly is a superlative, and it is used to describe that which is to the highest degree. So the idea here is to have the highest possible measure of regard for them who labor hard, lead well, and admonish with a loving spirit. To think highly of them with a high regard and love for them. This isn't condoning or commanding a blind nor a tenaciously loyal attitude towards leaders that are not right or biblical. There are times to raise problems to leaders. There are even appropriate biblical methods to confront pastors. But what this is saying is that when the leaders of the church fulfill their ministry well in the Lord, there ought to be a level of loving regard given to them. And then he makes this interesting statement at the end of verse 13, be at peace among yourselves. Now, it is possible that the elders of the church were not appointed by the Apostle Paul since he had to leave the city so abruptly. It's possible. This could have caused some tension among the people of the church about who left certain people to be in charge. It's possible that the tension was causing some divisions in the church, so Paul calls on them to recognize, esteem highly in love, and live at peace with one another so that you can actually structure and order the church properly so that the church can function as God intended for it to function. Okay, there's a little bit of word definitions in there, but here's the point. When I lived in Las Vegas, we had one of the great blessings of Las Vegas. There's a lot of curses about living in Vegas, just so you know. And yes, good things do come from Vegas. I grew up there, and one of the things we did is we enjoyed regularly the blessing of buffets. You know what I'm talking about? The spiritual gift of buffets. Let me ask a question. Let's just do a survey and see how godly you are. How many of you have ever been to a Las Vegas buffet? Let's raise a hand. Yes! You guys are awesome. They are spectacular. Now listen, I just feel like an overwhelming sense of guilt whenever I walk into a buffet. And that guilt goes away really quick, and it becomes like drooling at the mouth, running to the dessert table first, and then get the crab legs and everything else. It is amazing. It is spectacular. It is overwhelming. When I was there, we had the Rio buffet, which was like the taste of the world. And you just go to like 12 different tastes of the world. You could go to Chinese food. You could go to all the other, I don't even know what other food there's. There's all these other food that you could go to. It was amazing. And if you didn't like one food, you just be like, I'm going to go to the next food. And you're like, oh, I don't look good. That mashed potatoes looks a little crusty. I'm going to go to the next thing. Or, man, that steak hasn't been there that long. Now, normally it wasn't, but you could just go. Now, look, listen, we're not talking about Golden Corral here. We're talking about a heavenly feast made for a king. Now, here's what I'm saying. What you did in these buffets is you picked and chose. Picked and chose. You got that? You know what I'm talking about. You just picked and chose what you wanted. No, that don't look good. Oh, I like that. In fact, you could go from counter to counter. If you didn't like something at that counter, you go to the next counter. In fact, not only that, if you didn't like that buffet, just go next door. There's another one just like it. And there's another one down the road just like it. And there's another one across the street just like it. If you didn't like it, just go to the next one. And here's what has happened, I believe, let me just narrow it to our American church culture. We have treated church like it is a Las Vegas buffet. We have become a culture of consumerism. We have become a place where customers shop around for a church that provides them the benefits that they are looking for. They attend and support the best church, and if that church fails them, they move on to another one. And I'm not talking doctrinal failure. I'm talking a lot of times it's just preferential failure. And the part of the problem with all of that is you take it to the next level, and pastors and churches have bought into this and now try to build a platform to market themselves rather than on the altar of their praise there only be one name lifted high. Now it's become consumerism. So I've got the coolest guy, I've got the coolest band, we've got the greatest children's ministry, we've got the coolest building, we've got all of this. Come and see, come check out our buffet. And what Paul is leaning into here is the reality that church is not a buffet, it's a living organism. It's a family of God. It's the household of God. And as the household of God, there are some specific roles and responsibilities that we have to one another. Like, look, I own the weight, and it's a weight that I willingly accept to say, I'm going to labor hard for you. Like, I want to work until I'm tired. There's nothing better for me than at the end of the day and our staff to go home and lay our head on our pillow and be like, man, I'm so tired because of the work and labor we did on behalf of the church. And I want to lead well, and I want to warn well through the preaching of the word. And your responsibility towards the leadership of the church is to respect, highly esteem, and be at peace with one another so that the proper church, or the church, can properly function as a healthy organism and living hope can thrive. You following that? Okay, so you and I have this relationship. You and I value leaders rightly. When we work together to give attention to making sure the culture of our church is right, one of the factors that goes into it is that we value leadership rightly, and leaders own the responsibilities they have. Secondly, our church is healthy when you and I serve others carefully. So in verse 14 and 15, Paul shifts his attention and he says, and we urge you, brothers. So now he's addressing the brothers. To 12, he addresses the brothers to respect those who labor and lead. In verse 14, he now instructs the brothers to serve one another. The family of God is the church partaking in mutual ministry of serving one another. Now, I would love to take the next 4 hours and just pull out each one of these types and styles of ministries, and I know you wouldn't appreciate that. So let's just look at them and give you the snippets. We urge you, brothers, admonish the idle. Admonish the idle. Now again, the word admonish is the same word used for pastors in their ministry of leading and warning, and now it is amongst the brothers to warn one another. And the word idle literally means the unruly, or those who step out of rank in their marching orders. Those who refuse to follow the instruction of the apostle. And he says, loving brothers and sisters in the congregation warn and confront and address those who fall out of line with what the Bible and what Scripture calls on us to do. This is admonition, the ministry of counsel, the ministry of warning, the ministry of calling out the potential for error and disruption in the flow of the church. This is a ministry of love. It's a ministry of sensitivity. It's a ministry of humility. It's a ministry that is spiritual and biblical. In fact, the Bible even tells us in Colossians to let the word of Christ dwell in us richly so that we can teach and admonish one another in all wisdom. It's a beautiful ministry. It's a beautiful word, and it's something that we need to own as members of the church. Secondly, he says this. Look at verse 14. Encourage the faint-hearted. The word encourage literally means to come alongside of and speak to. It's this word that was used when the people in John chapter 11 came to console Mary and Martha because of the death of their brother Lazarus. They came alongside of and they said, it's going to be okay. The faint-hearted means literally, this is a cool word, it means literally in the original language, small-souled or little-spirited. It has the idea of despondent, discouraged, and worried. And so Paul says the idea here is to come alongside of and speak softly and tenderly and encouragingly towards those who are small-spirited or down in their spirits. It possibly was that there were people discouraged over the loss of their loved ones. It could have been that they were discouraged due to the trials that they were facing. The use of the word could have meant that they were going through bondage or some type of imprisonment as it was used in the book of Exodus. It could have been that there was just this reality of the weight of what they were facing in their community in the last days that Paul says, when they get there, come alongside of them and encourage them. And in fact, Paul modeled this ministry well in 1 Thessalonians when he said, as a father, I spoke to you, exhorted you and encouraged you. He came alongside of you and said, it's okay, we got this. The next phrase he says, I'm going to pull it all together here, but notice what he says, help the weak. The word help literally means to hold on by. So it has the idea of coming alongside of and propping up. It has the idea of putting yourself over and against another and to keep close. It's the same word used in Matthew 6 that says you will either hold on to God or money. You will grip it and you will hold it tight. That's the word. Titus tells us that we must hold firm to the truth. Same word, hold on tight. I felt like this was illustrated for me yesterday when I was believing I was a young man, which, believe it or not, I'm not what I was. I'm older than I was yesterday, a few years ago. And I tried to teach my son how to do a bunny hop and a papa wheelie on his bike. And I got out there, I'm in my sandals, I'm in my shorts, I'm in my t-shirt, and I'm like, Adrian, do a bunny hop. He's like, I don't know how. I'm like, here, let me show you. Like a good dumb dad does, right? So I jump on the bike and I say, here's how you do a papa wheelie. And I go to papa wheelie and no big deal. I just overpulled and I came back and fell off the seat a little bit. But when I went to put my foot down, the burning sensation in my Achilles ripped up my calf. And now I'm on a little bit of medication this morning, so I'm okay. But later today, I'm going to be limping again because my Achilles had this weird, and I'm sitting there in the street and Allie said, Dad, you're going to hurt yourself. And I'm like, you don't know how true that is. I actually did. Listen, I'm not kidding. I woke up this morning with an incredibly tight lower back and an ankle that wouldn't move because I did a papa wheelie. So frustrating. You know what I needed? At that moment, I needed, I think, somebody to come out there, put their arm around me and say, come on, old man, let's walk back to the house. That's what I felt like. That's the picture when I read the word, when it says help the weak. The spiritually weak, the financially weak. There's no qualifier on what the word weak here specifically identifies. There's not. It could be anybody who had a deficiency, a disease, and lack of opportunity or finances or some sort of a spiritual problem. Maybe they were weak in their faith. Maybe they were still struggling like he described in 1 Thessalonians 3 over the persecution, or in 1 Thessalonians 4 over holiness and sexual immorality. We don't know for sure, but he says the ministry that we have one with another is to help them. Now listen to this. It's illustrated in this way. Think about your arm. And there's 3 ministries that you carefully choose how you interact with them, picturing your arm. With one, the admonishment, you use your arm to point at the unruly. And with that, you say, again, let's qualify that with love and care and compassion and a lot of biblical information and spiritual guidance. You point with your arm, and to some, you may need to say, hey, no more. Listen, that's not right. It's the finger that points at my son and says, Adrian, get back in line. Get yourself together. With love and care and compassion, the church ministers at times in that way. The other part of the ministry is the arm who's touching the shoulder of the faint-hearted. And with that same arm that was doing warning is now wrapping their arm around somebody who has a down spirit and is leaning into their ear and is saying, it's okay. The promises of God are still true. The power of God is still in there. It's okay. Let's lift up our hearts. And with that same arm, you're coming around somebody who actually is weak and struggling, and you're picking them up, and you're holding them, and you're carrying them, and you're ministering to them by literally holding them up and moving forward with them. See the difference? There's carefulness in our attitude towards one another. And listen, a good, healthy church, first of all, understands when the different ministry needs to be exerted and given. And there's times when we need to love one another enough to say, hey, I just want to come to you and warn you. You're stepped out of line, and I just want to love you. Come back to this Christ. Come back to the Bible. Come back to the right way. And there's other times when you need to put your arm around them and whisper in their ear and say his power is enough. And there's other times you just need to pick them up and carry them onto the sidewalk where their Achilles can be fixed. There's times that those are appropriate. And the ministry that is a healthy ministry is a ministry where the body of Christ doesn't say, give me, give me. It's the ministry of people who says, how can I give to you? How can I serve you? Listen, I understand the weight and burden you bear, and you may feel like I'm the one that needs to be warned, or I'm the faint-hearted, or I'm the weak, and I understand that. But the beautiful thing about mutual ministry is that as you serve others, others serve you. And there's this reciprocating ministry that takes place in a church when we own this reality. Without time to do so, he says to do it with patience to everybody. That's just long-suffering. Like, don't lose your patience. Don't be that guy who honked at me last night because he had no patience and ticked me off. And I realized I am the one who had no patience because he honked at me. Don't be that guy. Don't be me. But patience with us all. Patient with them all. And then he says it this way in verse 14, which is such a good principle. See that no one repays anyone evil for evil, but always seek to do good to one another and to everyone. Like eye for an eye, tooth for a tooth, that's what's acceptable. You punch me, I punch you. You insult me, I insult you. You don't talk to me, well, I ain't talking to you. You put something mean on my Facebook page, I'm putting something mean on your Facebook page. We're going to fight fire with fire. You know what I'm talking about? That's the reality of the world in which we live and the thought process that we have. And he says, not amongst the church. The church says, I'm not going to revenge. I'm not going to seek to get back at you. I'm actually going to seek to do you good in response to the wrong that you did me. That is spiritual maturity that works to create a healthy church environment. You following that? This is the idea of loving others. And when loving of others blossoms in our church, people who don't know Jesus start becoming attracted to him and figuring out what the difference is. Years ago, I had some friends of mine and some missionaries that I knew named Bob and Mary Johnston. Bob and Mary Johnston have now passed away, and they've gone on to be with the Lord. They were missionaries for years and years in Haiti, and started a church to the Haitians on the island, or in the part of the island of Haiti. One day they were robbed at gunpoint. Several Haitians broke into the church in their house, robbed them at gunpoint, and stole all of their valuables, and during that whole process also raped Mary Johnston, the missionary wife. Obviously traumatic experience and overwhelming and devastating to them. Because of that, obviously, they came back to America and left Haiti for a while. They just had to heal and figure that all out. After many years of being here in America, both Bob and Mary were overwhelmed by the presence of God in their life and said, we've got to go back. God's moving us back. We love those people. We need to go back to Haiti. And so Mary actually initiated it and said, Bob, I know what God's doing in our lives. Let's go back to Haiti. I walked with him one day through Colorado, the streets of Colorado, talking to him and hearing his story. And he said, Andrew, he said, there was one day we got back to Haiti. When we arrived back to Haiti, people lined the streets celebrating us coming. It was amazing. It was supernatural. God was in it. And we had this special service for us coming back. And he said, I went out to the service and I was just getting some last minute things ready. And I looked down and I saw my shoes that were stolen on a guy sitting in the church service. And he said, I observed and I recognized him. He was one of them. He broke in, he robbed and raped and did all the wrong that you could have imagined. And he said, I went back behind in my office and I fumed. I was angry. I wanted to go out there and destroy that man like I think any man would, right? He said the Spirit of God just leaned into him and broke him, humbled him. And he said, I couldn't. So I just went on with the service and the gospel was preached. And he said, you know what? That man came to know Jesus Christ that night. And the power of this attitude that responds to wrong, whether within the church or, as Paul says, the same attitude extended to everyone, oozes with the gospel. It is Romans 5, 6, and 8, that while we were in our sin, Christ died for us. That's the picture that I believe Paul is unfolding before us here. To not repay evil for evil, but seek to do good to one another. And there is no better good than to invest into the spiritual maturity and the salvation of the soul of the people that you are doing good to. That's the picture of a healthy church. You following that? So there's a relationship with one another. There is not just a valuing of the leaders of the church rightly, and there's not just this serving one another carefully. That's the second point, but then I want you to see lastly, and man, this gets difficult. Let's just be honest. And that's this. Our church is healthy when you and I worship God perpetually. Look at verse 16, 17, and 18. It's an attention given now. Now remember, 12 and 13 was relational health between leaders and the church. 14 and 15 was relational health between the people of the church. And now 16, 17, and 18 describes relational health between the church and God. And he uses some words, some descriptors: rejoice, pray, and give thanks. There are words that are synonymous with worship. Worship of God. Notice the first one, verse 16. Rejoice always. Now, obviously, we read that and we're like, man, that's not going to happen, right? That's hard. So the question we need to ask is, does rejoicing always mean that you always go around with a smile on your face? Like, you ever meet that person? You're like, dude, calm down, bro. Like, why are you so happy all the time? Like that can't be real. Like, I met a guy like that one time, and I was like, that dude's the fakest dude I know. He's not happy all the time. His life can't be that good. I was just mad that his life appeared to be better than maybe what I thought mine should have been. In fact, that's not, though, what he's saying. Are you sinning if you ever feel sad, depressed, upset, or grieved? Well, it can't be, because then Jesus was a sinner, because the Bible says in John 11 that Jesus wept. So he wasn't rejoicing always, because he wept for Mary and Martha and the death of Lazarus. As he faced the cross, Jesus prayed with a loud crying and tears, according to Hebrews 5:7. So he was sinning. Or Paul was sinning when it described himself as sorrowful, yet always rejoicing. Or in Romans, when he tells us to rejoice with those who rejoice and weep with those who weep. He doesn't say, get on those who are weeping to stop weeping and put a smile on their face, to just be happy all the time. That's not what he's saying. So he wrote this, remember, to new believers who were suffering persecution because of their faith. This also follows Paul's exhortation that we should not get even when someone mistreats us. So there's a context of trial and persecution. So considering their difficult circumstances, the command to rejoice always must be viewed not primarily as a feeling or emotion, but as an act of obedience. Let me explain it this way. When we are in the difficulty of trials, or if people have wronged us or mistreated us because of our faith, we have a choice. Either we can focus on our trials and lapse into self-pity and frustration and depression, or we can set our minds on the things above, where Christ is at the right hand of God and where our life is hidden with him, and in that rejoice in all of those situations. So rejoicing always is a conscious attitude of contentment, hope, and happiness that comes from deliberately focusing on Christ and the eternal treasures that we have received freely from him. It's a choice. Joy is an emotion. Rejoicing is a choice in the midst of the difficult situation. I'll give you one illustration and we'll move on. Acts chapter 16 records for us the account of Paul and Silas in Philippi. You guys know the story, right? Preaching the gospel, thrown into the Philippian jail. And there at midnight, when they could have and should have been angry, maybe even complaining, the Bible says they prayed and sang hymns of praise to God. Did you think that Paul and Silas were like, dude, this is great. I didn't know the jail was going to be like a resort. This is awesome. Praise Jesus. Like these big feather beds and this nice like toilet and bathroom. There's not even any rats in here. This is amazing. That wasn't what they were thanking God for. What they were doing is they said, we're in the situation. We hate the situation. I can assume that to be true. But we're going to choose to rejoice and sing praises to our God for what he has done and is doing. And as a result of that, the Philippian jailer was saved. His house came to know Christ. And the church in Philippi was started because a worship service broke out in jail. A choice to rejoice. Listen, I don't know what your situation is. But whenever you hitch your joy or your ability to rejoice to the circumstances of your life, you will be a manic mess. But when you make the choice to rejoice out of response to the goodness of God in spite of the difficulty of your situation, then you will be a person who can actually obey verse 16 to rejoice always. Secondly, he says, pray without ceasing. It doesn't mean that you walk around praying every moment, does it? Like, that guy's talking to himself again. Like, what's he praying? What's he doing? He's praying constantly. He's just constantly praying. Like, everywhere he goes, he's talking. That's not the idea. That's not the idea. In fact, the without ceasing is a word that was used to describe a hacking cough. So it's this cough, like if you have a hacking cough that you can't get rid of, this is the wrong season to have that because everybody just assumes you have COVID and like runs from you. And you get that. It's this little tickle that won't go away. You may even be fighting it right now or popping cough drops. And it's a reflex reaction to the tickle. The tickle is something going on in my throat. My reflex action is to cough. That's the picture. Our reflex action to the prompting of the Spirit of God or the rising of occasions that demand prayer is the attitude of my reflex being, I'm going to God about this. Hey, how are you going to handle this? I don't know. I'm going to go to God about this. New situation arose. I'm going to go to God about this. I'm going to pray constantly. My reflex is not to worry. My reflex is not to get overwhelmed. My reflex is not to lash out. My reflex is not to enter into a pit of despair. My reflex is, in response to the tickle of the situation of my life, is to get on my knees before God and continually declare my dependence upon him and never give up on the power of prayer. Pray without ceasing. And then lastly, verse 18, give thanks in all circumstances. Gratitude, not a feeling that dictates your choices. It's a choice that affects your feelings. You don't give thanks regardless of your situation or for your situation even. You give thanks in your situation for what God has done. He's not prescribing for us how we must feel. He is calling on us to choose to rejoice and thank God on the basis of what is true, regardless of how happy or thankful we feel. Rejoice always, pray without ceasing, and give thanks in all circumstances. An old preacher used to say, you can choose to be grumbly hateful or humbly grateful. It's your choice. And he says this, verse 17, this is the will of God in Christ Jesus for you. There's a lot of talk in the Christian world about what's God's will for my life. I'll tell you what God's will is for your life. It's to make a choice to rejoice, never stop going after him in prayer, and give thanks for him in all of your circumstances. Living Hope thrives in a healthy local church. You get that? It's healthy when leaders serve well, love well, and lead well, biblically. And that health is exuded or blossoming when the church body says, I highly regard the importance of pastoral leadership in my life. I'm submitting to and following their lead. I love it. I'm thankful for it. And in love, I regard them. And I'm going to be at peace with one another in support of the leadership that God has placed in my church. That's a healthy church. And I just want you to know, I'm not speaking for myself. I'm going to X myself out of this situation. Church family, you've got some incredible leaders that help you and love you and pray for you in this very church. You've got some incredible leaders who serve you and work hard for you. Healthy church recognizes that, loves that, and seeks to honor that and thank God for that. A healthy church is a church where the members lovingly and carefully serve one another. We serve one another. We admonish, we encourage, we help. The overriding spirit with which this is done is patience and doing good to each other even when offended. And a healthy church is a church that chooses to rejoice, chooses to pray, and chooses to be thankful, not when and if their circumstances are favorable, but in all things. So like the soil where you plant your trees and your plants and how they need intentional work and effort, this type of a healthy church does not happen on accident. Nobody trips over a perfect church, a healthy church. There's no perfect church, but nobody trips over a healthy church as they're just walking through life. It takes intentionality, it takes maintenance, it takes proactivity, and I'm calling on you. Would you help us with that? Would you help us be a church that lifts high the name of Jesus, that serves one another well, and follows and submits to the leadership God has placed in the church? That is a healthy church. Tracking? You following? You good? All right. 3 quick questions, like super quick, and we're done. Ask yourself this, learning to live. What is my connection to the church? If you're a seeker, are you a skeptic? Are you a servant? Here's how you get connected to the church. The connection to the church starts with a connection to Jesus through salvation. So the connection here in this body starts with a relationship with Jesus Christ. So what's your connection to the church? And this type of church can become a reality in your life when you first enter into a relationship with Jesus Christ. Second, ask yourself this, please. Where do I keep Living Hope from thriving? If we were to go back and you were to say, this is one area that I need to pay attention to, that's the answer to this question. Is there an area that you feel like I need to address because I might be one that is hindering the thriving of Living Hope in my church body? be honest, and respond appropriately. And the last question is a missional question, and that's this: who needs to experience our healthy gospel community? When our church is healthy and God is glorified and people are being helped, encouraged, and reached, there are people in your life who need that. Who in your life needs that? And how can we invite them to come and be a part of what God is doing here? The big idea is simple. Living Hope thrives in a healthy local church. Let's be it. One of the things that God gave us to help us maintain health in our church is things like what we're going to do in a second.